From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the African Middle East Division. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, I'm Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted to see you all here to attend this very exciting program. I always start with something that many of you have heard me say before, but I always say a little thing about our division. And our division is made up of 3 sections. The African section that covers the whole continent of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and then the Near East section that spreads out into Central Asia, to Afghanistan, of course includes the Middle East, and then the Hebraic section that includes actually collections from the entire world. And we collect, we serve these materials here in our reading room, and we also organize conferences around specific topics. We have exhibits, and we had a big exhibit on the Hebrew book 3-4 years ago, which was an enormous hit. We highlighted some of our treasures here at the library. And we digitize materials to make them more accessible. Our own staff in each section, our own staff are made up of scholars who write and publish and digitize and scan and do all kinds of wonderful things. And throughout the year, we invite scholars to come and to talk about their books and the research they've carried out and the discoveries they've made. And in this way, they inform our patrons, they inform our researchers about the state of research in their field, but also about the countries. We are responsible for 78 countries in this division. And so they let us know, they're the scholars who bring to us the knowledge from these books that we collect and that we serve. So we're always very, very grateful to have scholars come and talk to us. And today is a case in point. We have Mark Glickman here with us, and he's just published a new book, which is absolutely wonderful. And it sounded, as we were talking a bit earlier, not only like a great scholarly book, but also there's a bit of the thriller in it, as you will see when he presents it himself. Stolen Words, the Nazi Plunder of Jewish Books is his newest book, and we really are very excited to have him come and share with us his research and his insights. And before I go any further, I would like to introduce our own Sharon Horowitz, a pillar of this division and someone who always brings the most exciting people to the division to have them speak. So, reference librarian, senior reference librarian Sharon Horowitz. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. My name is Sharon Horowitz. I'm reference librarian in the Hebraic section, and I too want to welcome you to the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room. Thank you all for coming. Our speaker today is Mark Glickman. Currently, Rabbi Glickman is the interim rabbi at Congregation Beth Shalom in Baton Rouge. He's a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, and he received his rabbinical ordination from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He has lectured frequently, has taught in institutions of higher learning, and has published in the print media on Jewish topics. His first book, published in 2011, was Sacred Treasure, the Cairo Geniza. Today, we will hear about his newest book, Stolen Words, the Nazi Plunder of Jewish Books. This book relates the odyssey of Jewish books in the wake of the Holocaust, why the Nazis gathered these books. As one reviewer stated, Glickman tells of this often overlooked aspect of the Holocaust, how the written word can be abused for the sake of cultural genocide, and finally, about the struggle to establish restitution protocols after the war. The Hebraic section has a connection to these books, originally stolen by the Nazis from their victims. Between 1949 and 1952, the Library of Congress received more than 5,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and newspaper issues from the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, a New York-based umbrella organization that has served as a trusteeship for the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust. By agreement, the JCR received these airless and unidentifiable books from the United States military government in Germany, which had taken exhaustive steps to identify and restitute items seized by the Nazi regime from their original owners, to return them, to their original owners or to their countries of origin. The JCR subsequently distributed most of these orphaned books, to scholarly institutions in the United States, Israel, Europe, and Latin America. Items that the Library of Congress received from JCR bear a unique book plate marking their special provenance. In addition, the Library of Congress also received about 150 Hebraic volumes bearing the stamp of anti-Semitic Nazi organizations that are also likely to have been seized by the Nazis from Jewish victims. In recognition of the special provenance of these books, the Library of Congress has created a virtual library aggregating both collections in its online catalog under the Holocaust-era Judaic Heritage Library. The full bibliographic record for each work includes a provenance note indicating the specific acquisition source and accession date for each title. And now, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Mark Glickman.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to Marianne. Thank you to the Library of Congress for this wonderful opportunity to be here this morning. I hope everybody can hear me. I ordinarily like to move around and get closer, but I'm told that I'm anchored here to the podium because of the requirements of the filming. I appreciate especially your coming out today because it really gives me an opportunity to speak about the story of the looted literary treasures and the looted books of the Holocaust that comprises such an important and, as Sharon said, largely unknown chapter of Holocaust history. There are many ways we could tell the story of the looted books of the Holocaust. We could start the story in many different places. I like to start it in a snowy day in February, late February 1946, almost exactly 70 years ago, in Hamburg, in Germany. It was evidently a snowy and blizzardy day that day, and at the airport arrived a young man by the name of, let me see how I can make this work here, Captain Seymour Pomerance. Seymour Pomerance was a fascinating man, an Orthodox Jewish archivist who had been doing some work in Germany on some of the material that had been discovered. And he had been summoned to Frankfurt, and he was picked up at the airport by a man named Lieutenant Leslie Post, who began to drive him across the Main River towards a suburb of Frankfurt called Offenbach. And on the way, he explained that there was some material that the Allied forces had discovered as the war was ending that he had been assigned to sort through. And Lieutenant Post evidently was out of his league in sorting through this stuff. He went on to be an accomplished scholar, but at this point he was very young, and he was having trouble just dealing with what he had to deal with. They drove across the Main River, and they soon arrived at a warehouse that had belonged before the war to the I.G. Farben Chemical Company. This was a company that, among other things, manufactured some of the component elements to Zyklon B gas, the gas that was used in the gas chambers of Nazi Europe. And now it's being used to house some recovered Jewish material. Pomerance walks into this building, what would soon be known as the Offenbach Archival Depot, and he couldn't believe what he saw, because there in front of him was an ocean of books, an ocean of material. It reminds me, do you remember that final scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark? That scene where he's in the warehouse and just row after row after row of box stuff. Well, here you have that, except it's not so neatly stored as it was there. You have this chaos of material. He took one look at it and realized that he was looking at the literary ruins of a lost civilization, of a civilization that had just been destroyed. He was astounded, and he said he almost felt like crying. He didn't know how he was going to possibly deal with all of this material. Well, he soon got to work, and he created what was officially known, as I said a moment ago, as the Offenbach Archival Depot. He hired a staff of a couple hundred German citizens, as well as a few of his military advisors, and they began sorting through this material. They divided it into three categories. First was the identifiable material, that material whose ownership from before the war was readily evident, and where they could, they restituted the books to their original owners. He was kind of limited because there was this principle, there's a legal principle known as escheat, which says that he can only restitute war booty to governments and not to individuals. So they would send huge shipments out to Holland, to other countries where they knew that their national libraries had been the original owners of this material. There was also the semi-identifiable material that might have a mark on it that seemed to indicate where it was from, but there was no definitive proof, or perhaps there was a person's name on it, but they didn't know what happened to that person. And then there was a great deal of the material that was completely unidentifiable. So they began going through this material, and as they did, Captain Pomerance took note of what he was dealing with and started to ask himself how all of this happened. He knew, along with the rest of the world, that the Nazis early in the war had another way of dealing with their looted literary material, which was what? Burning them. And he had heard the reports from May 1933 of this huge rash of Jewish book burnings. But what he didn't realize, what I certainly didn't realize at the beginning of this research, was that while the Nazis did burn books at the beginning of the war, they only did so for a short time. The book burnings only lasted, for the most part, during a 3-week period in May 1933. They were a way for Hitler to sort of establish his toehold in the German cultural imagination, because these book burnings were great spectacles, and there were fire chants, and there were incantations, and there were fiery speeches, and then they had these big bonfires. What many people didn't realize, and certainly has been forgotten now, is that those book burnings, they didn't work really well. First of all, it's hard to burn a book. Books, physically, it's hard to burn a book. Books burn far more like logs than they do like kindling. So if you throw a book if you try to touch a match or something to a book, it's not going to catch fire very easily. And we have accounts of people whose books were thrown into these bonfires one night, going out there the next morning, picking the books up and brushing the ashes off and taking them home. And it's also, figuratively speaking, it's hard to burn a book, because in the age of printing, of course, if you burn one copy, or even if you burn 100 copies of a book, there are going to be other copies around in other places. Helen Keller was one of the authors whose books were burned, and she said, "You are fools if you think you can destroy ideas." So sometimes you can destroy a few copies of a bound book, but you can't destroy the book itself, because the book itself is going to survive. Aside from that, the book burnings brought the Nazis really bad press. They were seen in the international media as thugs and oafs for having done this, if you can believe such a thing. The books, many of them were chosen because there had been a blacklist of prohibited authors that had been published before the book burning, so that they could have some guidelines as to what material to confiscate. And there were authors around the world who were complaining of being whitelisted. They were complaining that they weren't on the list. And the worldwide press really just excoriated Germany for doing this thing. And of course, they were looking forward in 33, they were all already looking forward to a big event that was going to happen in Germany in 1936, which was what? The Olympics. And they knew that if they were still doing such things when the Olympics came to town, that it would not look good on the world stage. So quickly, the book burning stopped. They flared up again, if you will, a few years later in Kristallnacht at the end of 1938. But for the most part, this was just a brief spate of book burnings that happened in 1933. In the late 1930s, Hitler was approached by one of his main ideologues, one of the main intellectuals in the Nazi regime, a Nazi soldier, a Nazi official with the unlikely name of Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg was an intellectual, if you could call him that. It was probably more of a pseudo-intellectual. He wrote a book called The Myth of the 20th Century, which was the second best-selling book in all Germany, second, of course, only to Mein Kampf. And it was this 700 or 800 page tome with thousands of footnotes. And apparently, if you were the kind of person who would fail to see the emperor's new clothes, you would have admitted that this was an impossible piece of work to read. It was kind of like, remember the book A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking? Everybody had this book on their shelves when it came out. Nobody, I think, ever understood a word of what he was saying in there, but it looked great on the shelf. And so too, the far more voluminous Myth of the 20th Century. Rosenberg was a rising star in the Nazi regime. He was not in Hitler's inner circle, but he was trying to get there. He was eventually put in charge of all the territories, the conquered territories in the East. But he was also an intellectual, and he went up to Hitler, and he knew that Hitler had long dreamed of opening the Hochschule, an institute for higher learning that would really be a testament to the great intellectual achievement of German civilization. And he went to Hitler and he said, "My Fuhrer, why don't you allow me to start to build these institutions? And how about if part of it is an institute for Jewish research? Let's open, in fact, a series of institutes for Jewish research after the war to study this extinct Jewish people. Because the Jewish people, of course, will soon be extinct, and it's going to be important for the world to know, just like we know about other extinct civilizations, it'll be important for the world to know what this civilization was about and who to teach them. Who can teach the world about this extinct civilization, if not the great Nazi regime?" And so Hitler gave him permission to build these institutes, and Rosenberg said, and of course, if we're going to have these institutes, we're going to need some libraries. And if we're going to have libraries, we're going to need to put books in the library. So Hitler gave Rosenberg permission to gather books from the conquered territories of the Nazi regime. When the Nazis would take over a new territory, he would be able to go in and take and confiscate some Jewish books. But of course, in the late 1930s, there weren't many conquered territories. But in 1940, in May of 1940, Germany invaded and took over France. And it was like a treasure chest opened up before Alfred Rosenberg's eyes. Because, of course, throughout France, particularly in Paris, but elsewhere, there were all kinds of Jewish libraries, private libraries, institutional libraries that had been abandoned by Jews who were fleeing Nazi oppression. And it was very easy for Rosenberg to go in and to take over the material that was in that library. He created what was called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Rosenberg Task Force, otherwise known as the ERR. When you study this, especially if you don't know German, it's a challenge to learn these multisyllabic German words. He created the ERR, which went out and went to these libraries and confiscated the material. And originally it was all sent to Frankfurt and was stored elsewhere as well as the war went on. And he established a routine where the Nazis would go in and they would take over a town, and this was especially so as the Nazis went into Poland and Russia and other places in Eastern Europe. And the routine was a simple, if not tragic one. The Nazis would go into a town, they would empty that town of its Jews. The Jews would be taken out to the outskirts of town sometimes and shot right there, or loaded up into cattle cars and taken off for execution in one of the death camps. And shortly after that, the ERR guys would go in and they would load up the Jewish books from the homes, from the libraries, from the synagogues, from the schools, and they would take them off to a collecting point somewhere nearby. We'll get to those collecting points in a while. And soon, the library, the Nazi Jewish library, grew. Rosenberg was not the only one collecting books. Under the leadership of another man named Reinhard Heydrich, even more books were collected. These were collected from within Germany itself. Rosenberg was collecting them outside Germany. Heydrich was collecting them from within the territories, from within the lands of the Third Reich itself. He was able to unify all of the various German police forces, security forces, into one single organization. In my book, by the way, I compared the Nazi organizational chart to a Jackson Pollock painting with a German language overlay. To understand the way the Nazi regime was set up and to understand these various agencies and what they did and who they reported to is a gargantuan task. But what Heydrich was able to do was to take many of these security institutions with overlapping responsibilities and to unify them and to now to talk about multisyllabic German words into the Reichssicherheitsamt. And if you knew how long it took me to learn how to pronounce that word, the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, and he too started to collect books in a similar way to the way Rosenberg did. There were other Nazi organizations that were doing the same thing. And so again, they would go into towns, and once they were emptied of their Jews, they would collect the books. They sent them to collecting points, and often these collecting points were in monasteries and in castles and in warehouses throughout the territories that the Nazis had taken over. So there were books stored here in the von Pless Castle. There were books stored here in this Torkow Castle. In dozens of places these books were stored. They were even stored in the famous Neuschwanstein Castle. Most of the material that was stored in Neuschwanstein was the looted artwork, but there were books stored there as well. As the war went on, it became more and more difficult to keep them in some of these storage places because the storage places themselves were taken over as the size of the Reich's land holdings began to shrink. And so slowly they began to consolidate the collections. And in Eastern Europe, most of the material was sent to a town called Radibor, and there's a way to pronounce that in modern Polish that I'm not going to even try to pronounce. Here you see a stockpile in Radibor, and then in Germany, they were sent to a town called Hungen, and they were stored in the castle and in other places there. These two towns were typically when you think of a storage facility, you think of a warehouse or a building of some sort. These were entire towns. As the volume of the material grew, these became entire towns whose every public building, for the most part, was devoted to storing this material. So the bank building would have material, the church, the community center would all be filled with these materials in these two towns. There were storage places elsewhere too, but the two largest ones were in Hungen and in Radibor as well. We're going to come back to Schloss Hungen in a little while. So to look at the contrast between 1933 and 1943 is astounding. In 1933, as you've seen, we had these orgies of book burning, but by 1943, it had moved to this, to Nazi soldiers and officials going through this material, sorting it out, trying to organize it. And again, the amount was just huge. They were only able to organize a small amount of it, but they did what they could. Now, not all the books went easily. By the way, we have until 1 o'clock including Q&A, is that correct? Including Q&A, okay. So not all the books went readily to their into Nazi hands. And one story that is important to tell are the books of Vilna. Vilna, which is now Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, was a teeming Jewish community before the war. Tens of thousands of Jews lived there, and there were Jewish theaters and Jewish newspapers and schools of all kinds. And even in its area around Vilna, there was an active and vibrant Jewish life. When the Nazis took Vilna over, they went into Vilna itself and all the towns around Vilna, and again, they collected the Jewish books. And originally, they sent them to the university to be sorted through and processed. But eventually, they realized that that didn't make sense, because outside of the Vilna ghetto, there is a library. There was a building that had belonged to YIVO, the Jewish Scientific Institute, an organization that before the war had been documenting the history of Eastern European Jewry. They had a huge library there already, and so it made sense to send all the books to this one library to get sorted through. The man in charge of the effort was a man named Johannes Pol. And here we should step back and take note of the fact that there was a cadre, there was a phenomenon during the war of Nazi Judaic scholars. This is also an untold story, largely, of World War II, is that the Nazi regime was able to boast of many people who were trained experts in Judaica, who knew Hebrew, who knew Talmud, who knew Jewish history. And they used that knowledge in a variety of ways in order to further the anti-Semitic aims of the Nazi regime. So here you have this man, Johannes Pol, who before the war had studied Jewish studies for a couple years at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And now he's put in charge of processing this material in Vilna. So what he did was he conscripted a few dozen Jewish literati from the Vilna ghetto. These were poets, these were historians, these were writers of different kinds. And every day, this group of people would be marched out of the Vilna ghetto to the YIVO library, where they would be assigned the task of sorting through this material. Since there was so much of it, they were told that they should sort through it and only keep the most valuable 20 to 30% of what they saw. And the rest of it was going to go to the pulp mill. And it's a very interesting story, therefore. You have these books being gathered, being collected in a central gathering place, being marched past an official for a cursory examination. Some books go one way, some books go the other way, and depending on which way they go, that will determine whether they have a chance of surviving the war. And in that sense, of course, the story of the books of the Holocaust is eerily parallel to that of the people of the Holocaust, although, of course, far less tragic. So these scholars, these people who loved books, who used to study in the YIVO library before the war, now were being brought there, and with every book that was put in their hands, they had an option. Either destroy it or give it to the Nazis. And often they were able, with great difficulty and having gone at great pain, they were able to make that decision. But sometimes they couldn't stomach either of those decisions. So what they started to do was, when they came across some of the really valuable material, they would put it aside, and at the end of the day, they would hide it in their clothing and bring it back with them into the ghetto for safekeeping. It is, to me, ironic that that inside the ghetto itself was seen as the safest place for these books to be. That's where they could keep their eyes on them. And so you would see at the end of the day, if you look closely, all of these scholars and poets and writers walking out of the YIVO library with puffed up clothes because there were these books inside, trying to sneak them back into the ghetto. At one point, somebody said, "Are you crazy? Are you nuts? They're books. You're risking your lives for books." And one of the members of this group said, "Well, books, they don't just grow on trees." The group called itself the Paper Brigade. And soon they realized that this process was going far too slowly, that they needed to speed things up if they were going to save anything close to the number of books that they hoped to save. And they realized that the guard at the YIVO facility, the Polish guard, was an untrained, almost deaf guy who felt badly about the fact that he was an uneducated guy. And so, out of the kindness of their hearts, a couple members of the Paper Brigade volunteered to tutor him at lunchtime every day. And while they did so, the other members of the Paper Brigade busied themselves taking as many books as they could and hiding them above the ceiling and behind the walls of the YIVO building, hoping that they would last there until after the war. One of the main members of this, one of the most well-known members of the Paper Brigade was a poet by the name of Avraham Sutzkever. He and Shmerka Kazarjinsky, they were both the only two people who survived until after the war. Sometimes at lunchtime or on breaks in their work, Avraham Sutzkever would sit down and write poetry, reflecting on his life and reflecting on his world when he was working in the YIVO facility. And in one of the poems he wrote, he used an image that Ann Brenner, is Ann here? Ann was, there's Ann, was able to help me unpack a little bit. Apparently in medieval poetry, and Ann, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I hope, they used the image was often used of the word as black pearls. The words were seen as black pearls on the page. And in a poem that he wrote, Sutzkever used that image. He riffed on that image, and he talked about the written word as a burnt pearl on the body of on the charred remains of a woman's body. We don't have the owner of the owner of the pearls left, and all that remains of her are the burnt pearls that she once wore. And he used that image as a way of looking at the words around him, that the owner's bodies themselves were being charred, and all that is remaining now are the burnt pearls, the books, the written words themselves. One other story, a couple of these stories of how some of the books survived are fascinating. There is a book, a very famous book called the Sarajevo Haggadah, a beautiful Passover Haggadah that was made originally in Spain and spirited out, we think, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and eventually made its way to Sarajevo in Bosnia. And it's a beautiful, illuminated book. Here you see a picture of a facsimile edition of the book that I have in my own library. When the Nazis took over Sarajevo, early on, one of the Nazi officials went to the Bosnian National Museum in order to get the Sarajevo Haggadah. And he walked in and he asked to see the library director, and he was introduced to the director. The director didn't speak any German, so they called on a man named Dervish Korkut to serve as an interpreter. Dervish Korkut was a young Muslim scholar who had done research in a variety of different fields, and he was able to help because he knew German and he knew the local language as well, and was able to help translate. And the Nazi official said, "I've come to get the Sarajevo Haggadah." And the director of the museum said, "I'm sorry, sir, one of your colleagues came this morning. I gave it to him." He said, "Who was my colleague who came this morning?" He said, "I didn't think it was appropriate for me to ask his name." He said, "So you don't have the Sarajevo Haggadah here?" "No, it left this morning." And so this German soldier, as I picture him, he kind of clicked his heels, and with an upset look on his face, he kind of turned and walked crisply out of the room, not realizing that during the entire conversation, the famous Sarajevo Haggadah had been hidden in Dervish Korkut's pants. He had put it in the waistband of his pants to hide it from the Nazi. And he and the head of the museum had colluded right before this talk in order to make sure that they saved this Haggadah. And they were able to save it for the duration of the war, and it still exists now in Sarajevo. what is important to note as well is that the Sarajevo Haggadah was not the only book that Dervish Korkut, was not the only thing, rather, that Dervish Korkut saved from Nazi hands during the war. He was also able to help rescue a young Jewish woman who showed up bedraggled and in great need of safe haven at his doorstep, and a great risk to his life and to that of his wife. The couple was able to shelter her until she could get somewhere safer during the war. So this was really a heroic man. We can also tell the story of a young couple, Hans Augusto and Margaret Riersbach, a young couple that had met in Brazil, German-Jewish couple. He was an advertising, and she was an artist, and they started to, on the side, make children's books in Brazil. Originally in Brazil, they took their honeymoon in the late 30s to Paris, and they fell in love with and were enchanted by the city. And like many people who go to Paris, they found themselves stuck. They couldn't leave. They loved it so much. And while they were there, they made some children's books. They started to create this character named Fifi. Fifi was this mischievous monkey who would get into all kinds of trouble. Right before the Nazis invaded Paris, they realized that they needed to get out of town. So they cobbled together a couple bicycles. They took the Fifi drawings and a few other personal belongings, put them on the back of their bicycles, because they knew that the Nazis, this was artwork, this was a book that was in the making. They knew that the Nazis were going to take this if they weren't careful. And on their cobbled-together bicycles, they rode out of Paris, and they eventually got on trains, and they went through Spain and Portugal, and then they eventually went back to Brazil. And after that, they came to the United States, where they changed their names from Hans Augusto Riersbach to Margaret Riersbach to H.A. and Margaret Ray. And Fifi, they changed Fifi's name as well. Does anybody know what Fifi's name became? Fifi became Curious George. So Curious George was among the books that slipped through Nazi hands during the war. When the war ended, the Allied forces went and found this material. And so we see Schloss Hungen again. There was a young soldier by the name of Robert Schoenberg who had grown up in Vienna and was an attorney there, but had to flee. And on his way out, he said that he wasn't ever going to come back to Europe again. And when he came to the United States, and his draft board found out that he was fluent in 6 languages, before he could say Anschluss, he was back on the boat back to Europe. And he was assigned a detail of soldiers one day in 1945 or 1946, and he was sent to check out some reclaimed material at Schloss Hungen, at the Hungen Castle, which was, remember, Hungen was one of the towns where all this material was sent. And he went up to the castle, and I think it was as I picture it, it was a dark and dreary day that day, with bats flying around the castle. And he knocked on the door, and it turns out that the owner of the castle, Princess Schloss Braunfels, Princess Solms-Braunfels, rather, was no longer living in the castle. She had to flee earlier in the war because it was discovered that she had been trying to help some Jews. However, her husband, her octogenarian husband, was still allowed to live in the castle. His name was James Pitcairn Knowles. He was a Scottish portrait painter, and he lived there all alone in the castle. It was just him and Alfred the Butler. And Alfred the Butler, and I'm not making this up, Alfred the Butler was also an octogenarian, doddering old man. He had been involved in the service industry for a long time, and several decades earlier, he had been a ship steward who was assigned the task of knocking on the door of the Astors and the Guggenheims, telling them that it was time to get to the deck of the Titanic immediately because the ship was about to go down. He was that guy. And now he's the butler in Schloss Hungen. So Schoenfeld goes up, he knocks on the door. Alfred the Butler opens the door and kind of says, well, we've been expecting you. Come on in. And they walk in and were astounded at what they saw, because throughout this entire castle, and we're only seeing part of the castle here in this picture, floor to ceiling, were bookshelves. Here, the books were perfectly organized, and the whole castle was filled with them, millions of books that had made their way there. And Alfred said, you may want to see what's in the basement. And he took out a skeleton key, opened the door to the basement, and they walked down. And there they found huge boxes with the library of l'École Rabbinique, the rabbinical academy in Paris, with priceless old books and manuscripts of all kinds. And then Alfred said, and you might want to see what's over here. And he beckoned them over to a cabinet, and he takes out another skeleton key, opens it up. It was the Rothschild's library in there, some of the great treasures from the Rothschild collection, incunables, some of the earliest printed Jewish books that existed, and there were manuscripts and all kinds of other priceless Jewish material. This happened in place after place after place as this material was collected. As we said, it was originally sent to Offenbach, and where the American army had to figure out what to do with this material. They restituted what material they could, but even as the war was coming to an end, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of remaining volumes, not sure what to do with it. And the issue quickly became a political one. Even amongst Jews, it became political, if you can imagine that. So the Jews in the soon-to-be-born state of Israel were saying, you know, we are the capital of the Jewish people here. This material should come to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. We'll take care of it like nobody else can or will. And Jews in the United States were saying, our community is now the largest Jewish community in the world. The books should come here. They should come to places like the Library of Congress and to some of the fine universities we have here. We can take care of them like nobody else can. And the survivors who were staying in Europe were saying, no, the book should stay here. The book should stay at home. And can you imagine what you would do if you were in the American Army and you found that some books came from a town library? You knew exactly where they came from, but that town, that Jewish community, was no longer there. Or if it were a huge library and only 10 people from that town survived. Or what do you do with the books if a large number had survived, but half of the people had gone to Israel and half had come to the United States? What do you do with it then? So there were all kinds of decisions, and it was becoming this very heated political issue, and the poor American army is caught in the crossfire between all these groups of bickering Jews. To their great fortune, eventually, in 1949, the occupation of Germany came to an effective conclusion. And as Sharon said earlier, the books were then turned over to a team of Jewish historians and other intellectuals called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Incorporated. This was an American-based organization that became the trustee of the Jewish people to deal with this material. The director was a prominent historian named Salo Baron at Columbia University, and for a time, the on-the-ground director in Europe was none other than the famous Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt. She spent a few years in Germany dealing with this material, and even in the most prominent biographies that have been written of Hannah Arendt, this barely merits a blip in the biographies that are told of her, but this was a major part of her life and what she did. They too had to figure out what to do with this material, and eventually they came up with a formula. It was their 40-40-20 formula. 40% of the books that they couldn't whose owners they couldn't identify, whose provenance was unclear, they sent to libraries in Israel. 40% they sent to libraries in the United States, and 20% they sent elsewhere. And the elsewhere was places like South Africa and Australia and Argentina and libraries there. They sent many of the books to DP camps early on so that the people in those camps could use them, but eventually then they had to decide what to do with them after the DP camps closed. Jewish cultural reconstruction existed, at least on paper, until 1977, and there was, into the early 1950s, there was a lot of material that they had to deal with, and there was just a trickle that they had to deal with afterwards, but it finally closed its doors in the late 1970s. Now, keeping my eye on the time, it's easy to get lost in the big numbers here, and I found that it's helpful to tell the story of one book that was part of the story to see how it really panned out in terms of that one book. And I thought we would take a book called Hilchot alFasi. It was written by a man named Rabbi Isaac alFasi, whose name literally means Isaac, the guy from Fez. He was from Fez, Morocco, home of the tasseled, kind of dorky looking hat. And he, in the 11th century, he and some of his colleagues were becoming concerned because Islam was starting to shimmer pretty brightly. Islam was becoming a temptation for Jews because it was this brilliant, becoming this brilliant and very rich, thriving intellectual corpus of material. And it was hard for rabbis to prevent people from converting to Islam because at the time, in order to study Judaism, there were only really, for the most part, 2 books that you could offer people who wanted to learn about Judaism. Those 2 books were what? The Torah and the Talmud. And aside from that, I mean, there were some other rabbinic works, but the Torah and the Talmud were really about it in terms of practically available material that students of Judaism could study. And the Talmud is a very difficult book to study. It's it's in Aramaic for one thing. It's in very terse language. It's governed by a lot of arcane principles, and so it was very hard for Rabbi Isaac alFasi and his colleagues to say you should stay with Judaism, and here's this great, rich literary heritage we have to offer you. So what alFasi did is he went through the Talmud and he took out and kept just the stuff that was of practical use for Jews those days. There's a lot of stuff in the Talmud about sacrifices. In the temple doesn't even exist anymore. He took all that stuff out. He took out all the material about the back and forth between the arguing and bickering rabbis of the Talmud. All that was left out. And he kept just the stuff that was of practical use. And he took the 20-volume Talmud and he sort of condensed it into a 3-volume Reader's Digest version of the Talmud, if you will. And Hilchot alFasi, the laws of Rabbi alFas, was one of the very first printed books ever. It was printed in Spain in the late 1400s. And there was a version printed in Constantinople not long after that. There were several versions printed in Italy. The 10th time a printing house got around to printing it was in the town of Sulzbach in Germany. And that was in the 1760s. There was one volume that came out in 1763, another in 64, and another in 65. So we can picture, say, the second volume of this book rolling off the presses in 1764. Most of the people who studied these books back then lived in Eastern Europe, but they were hard to print because a page of Talmud and a page of all these books has different fonts and there's different text blocks, and it's very difficult to lay out the printing. And in Eastern Europe, for the most part, they didn't have the resources to do this kind of printing, and so these books were typically printed in Western Europe, but read in Eastern Europe. So we can picture this book, second volume of alFasi, coming off the press and being loaded by a bunch of big brawny guys onto the back of a truck, or of a wagon rather, that wagon heading eastward. And we could picture it then arriving in some small town in Poland, being taken off the truck and purchased by a book distributor who the next day starts to make his rounds. And he goes to a little town and he shows up at the Beit Midrash, the adult study house in that town, where he's warmly greeted by the rabbi. He walks in carrying a big pile of books. He comes out with a far shorter pile because he's just sold our copy of the second volume of Hilchot alFasi, the laws of Rabbi alFas, to this Beit Midrash. The following day, a group of students, young students, come in and they break up into pairs, which is the way they would study back in the yeshiva and in the Beit Midrash. And in one pair of students, came across a question and they decided they wanted to consult the laws of Rabbi alFas, Hilchot alFasi. So they go to the shelf and they pull this book off, they open it up, they study it, they put it back. The next day, the same thing happens, except a different group of students takes the book off the shelf, opens it up, studies it, and puts it back. This happens day after day, month after month, year after year. For almost 2 centuries, it sits on the shelf of that Beit Midrash, until one day, the students don't come in. Because, of course, the students early that morning had been rounded up and taken outside to the outskirts of town, and they were all shot. And the day after that, the doors do open, and instead of eager young students, the darkness comes in. And a group of Nazi soldiers enters the building and takes our copy of alFasi and all the other books that they find and throws it in the back of a truck, where it's taken to a castle and stored somewhere until after the war. It's discovered after the war, sent to Offenbach. They open it up and they find that the stamp of that Beit Midrash, while it was still there, it had faded away so much they couldn't tell where it was originally from. So they kept it, and eventually the army turned it over to Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, who at the end of the war put it into their 40-40-20 formula and sent it to Israel, where it was purchased by the Librarian, the chief rabbinate of Israel. And it sat on the shelf there for several decades until they needed to clear some space in their library, and they, what librarians call, deacquisitioned the book. They sold it off to an antiquarian book dealer who purchased it and put it up online, where it was purchased by a customer in Washington State, and here it is. So this is a book that I purchased. I purchased it the way most rabbis purchase books these days, on eBay. And when I got the book, I opened it up, and I found on the inside was a bookplate, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Incorporated. At the time, I had no idea what Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Incorporated was, so I did what most rabbis do when faced with such conundra. Googled it, and that sent me onto this whole story that I wrote the book about. If only, of course, we had the people who own this, but we don't. And among the only physical relics we have of them are the books that they left behind. It reminds me of the words of Avraham Sutzkever, who died in 2010. And he wrote, "It is not just because my words quiver like broken hands grasping for aid, or that they sharpen themselves like teeth on the prowl in the darkness, that you, my written words, substitute for my world, flare up the coals of my anger. It is because your sounds glint like burnt pearls discovered in an extinguished pyre, and no one, not even I, shredded by time, can recognize the woman drenched in flame. For all that remains of her now are those gray pearls smoldering in the ash. All that remains of them now are these gray pearls. But it's what we have, and God willing, we can open the books again and let the pearls shine forth for us all to see in the future. Thank you very much." We have just a few minutes left for questions. Does anybody have any? Oh, we can go a little bit over. Okay, we have more than a few minutes left for questions. Yeah, way in the back. Yes. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The question is, were these Nazi Judaica scholars indicted for war crimes? And the answer is, some of them were kind of a little bit, but not much. Johannes Pol lived out his life. I think he got captured for a little while, but released shortly afterwards, and he lived out his life. I think something's telling me he moved to Canada after the war, but I'm not sure. Alfred Rosenberg, who was the head of all these scholars, he was tried in Nuremberg, in the first wave of Nuremberg trials, and he was executed. Most of the others were punished hardly at all. Hardly at all. And that's one of the great tragedies, if you will, is that these guys, they had a lot of these guys after the war. They knew where a lot of these guys were, but there was no effort to really make them accountable for what they had done. Yes, ma'am.
I'm puzzled by the sort of larger phenomenon of, this
Yes.
Obsession, really,
Yes.
that goes on to this day in different ways.
Well, well, I think the broader question is, why did they bother holding on to this stuff? Yes. Why, so that so why did they bother? And that's, of course, the question. And I got a great book I can suggest you read about that, which is available in the back of the room, by the way, and available on audio. But there are a few answers to that question. First, the Nazis were trying to show themselves to be cultured and enlightened people. They were very proud. I mean, Germany had long been a culture that prided itself on its books. So this was the great poets and novelists and writers that all come from Germany. And so they were working very hard to show themselves to be an enlightened people, a scholarly, intellectual people. This was the intellectual veneer that was put over the ugliness of Nazi Germany. That's one reason they did it. The other reason, or among the other reasons, there are a lot of reasons. Part of it was just triumphalism. Look at how we have become victors over this vanquished Jewish civilization. I think that's what they were trying to do as well. One of the other phenomena at play was what one scholar called working towards the Führer. Hitler, it turns out, was a very good orator. He was not a very good administrator. He would come in late in the day. He would, when his underlings would get in fights and conflicts with one another, he didn't want to be bothered with that at all. He kind of enjoyed watching them fight it out amongst themselves. And it made for a very chaotic administrative structure within the Nazi regime. I touched on that in my talk. And they were all competing. They were all trying to get Hitler's attention. And so if your agency could get more books, more material than the other Nazi agency, if Rosenberg's ERR could outdo the RSHA in their looting efforts, then that would be a badge of pride that they could wear as they went and appeared before the Fuhrer. So they were trying to impress Hitler as well. So there were a lot of reasons that they did this, and it all culminated in this largest campaign in history of literary pillage. So that's a partial answer to your question. I'm not sure I have a full answer, but I hope that's a partial answer. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the history of Yivo.
Yes.
And I feel like I should know the answer, but I don't quite have it in mind. I know that Yivo is now in New York.
Right.
And I believe that some of the people studying got out and were able to come to New York. You set that up usually during the war. But in terms of the books,
In terms of the books.
did they survive?
Yes, I should have said that. Thank you. Some of the books they were able to get out early in the war, and those went to New York. And now, as you said, Yivo is at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. So many of the books got out earlier in the war. The ones that the Paper Brigade tried to save, the majority of them were hit in bombing raids, especially the ones that were hid in the Yivo facility. That was hit by Allied bombs. And not all of them, but the majority of them were destroyed. Some of them survived, and they were able to get out a good number of them and bring them to New York after the war. But the majority sadly did not survive the war.
Knowing the German fetish for organization.
Yes.
So precise.
Yes.
Was there any scheme of organization for these books in a particular way that they want to do?
Yeah, the short answer to your question is, the question is, did they organize these books at all? And if so, how? The answer is no, they didn't, because there were just so many of them. They weren't able to. There were a few small efforts to do so, like the books in Schloss Hungen. They started to categorize them, but they were just such a huge mass of material, and they were of all different kinds of books that were looted. There were, priceless manuscripts, as well as trashy novels and children's activity books, and everything in between. And so there was just so much material that they simply didn't have time to organize it. I think that was the idea that they would get to after the war, once they collected it. Yes, sir.
Sort of an ironic question, but the Nazis hadn't, organized themselves to steal and store all of these priceless books and books. You speculate what would have happened in the chaos of wartime Europe? There's no organized efforts to save
Perversely, we have the Nazis to thank for preserving some of the Jewish books from before the war. Because they collected them and because they brought them into what, at least for a time, were secure places, they saved what may have, in many cases, been books that would have been destroyed. Certainly whole titles and many times priceless manuscripts they saved them in many cases. So we do have the Nazis to thank for that in a perverse kind of a way. Yes. Was that your question? Yes. Other questions? This looks like it's going to be our final question, so make it good.
You mentioned that some of the books from Offenbach were distributed on
Yes.
and once the books were there, the people take most of them with them and they find resettled or
No, I think the question is what happened to the books that went into the DP camps, and I think that they were eventually, don't quote me on this, but I think they were eventually sent back into JCR, to Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, and then went back into the system. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a delight to speak with you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.